I don't know how to describe it other than like a demon type of sound.
But it's silhouetted, hulking, every bit of 5.5 feet wide, 13 to 14 foot tall, pitch black.
The one thing that ran through my mind when I had this encounter was I don't have a big enough gun.
Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Welcome. These 5 stories from Alaska are being brought to you by William Jevning and are being narrated by me, Jim Sower. Story number 1. Alaska pilot watches as Sasquatch carries off his bride. Noted author on bear behavior, Alaskan Larry Kenniott, writes that he heard an interesting story. It's unconfirmed at this time, but allegedly was written up in Alaska Magazine at some point. Kenniott is investigating. In the meantime, he writes, "My friend Jack Gwaltney and I traveled to Wasilla, Alaska to meet with Ken Taylor, Jr., and Jack shared this story. He remembered the story's source when we reached the Best Western where we were to eat lunch. Jack said that he was pretty sure that Alaska Magazine carried the story around 1985. I've made a little effort to confirm the story at Anchorage's Lusac Library, but as of yet have had no success. In the spring of 2002, I stopped to see Andy Hall at Alaska Magazine regarding permission to use the story, if located, and talked with Jill Shepard, who was going to look in 1985 magazines for the story. I'll email Andy to see if he's discovered anything yet. Meantime, the story goes like this. Supposedly, a Nome, Alaska, or Bethel pilot and his newlywed wife were en route to Anchorage, where they would make connections for their honeymoon. The weather turned sour, so he touched down in a Cessna 180 or 185 on floats. He taxied to shore where he and his wife looked for a spot to pitch their tent for the night. Having found one, he turned toward the plane to fetch the tent, with his wife following him. He heard his wife scream and turned to see a hairy biped running from the location toward the woods with his wife under one arm. The pilot chased after the critter before realizing that he could best stop it with a firearm and returned to the plane to fetch his rifle. The pilot chased after the critter before realizing that he could best stop it with a firearm and returned to the plane to fetch his rifle. He followed, seeing them 3 times before he lost sight of them. He found only a particle of cloth from his wife's garment. He either spent the night in his tent and looked the next day, or flew on to Anchorage and reported the event to the Alaska State Troopers, who began a search but were unable to come up with any positive results. The wife was never found, and Jack told me that the pilot was distraught and a basket case for years. That's the end of story number 1. Story number 2. Kodiak Daily Mirror, Alaska story. A really creepy, scary, hairy man story that happened in and around Wrangell, Alaska, as told by a Kodiak man by the name of Dana Jack Allen. Also published in the Tundra Drums, Bethel, Alaska, February 1993. Hairy man tells hunter to leave us alone. Editor's note: when he saw a story in the February 1st Kodiak Daily Mirror about a request for stories of sightings of Alaska's hairy man, Dana Jack Allen decided to write down his own experience with the creature called, in other parts of the world, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or the Abominable Snowman. He subsequently also agreed to an interview. Jack Allen, a 40-year-old refrigeration mechanic, lives in Kodiak. By Nell Waaj. Kodiak Daily Mirror. Kodiak. Kodiak resident Dana Jack Allen is sure he's had several encounters with what some Alaskan natives call hairy man. the creature known in the Pacific Northwest as Bigfoot. He is also sure the creatures have given him a distinct message: leave us alone. Jack Allan's fascination with the creatures goes back to a cold morning in 1979 in the remote Etelin Island area near Wrangell. He and his hunting partner were hoping to harvest some of the deer they knew inhabited an alpine meadow at the head of the fjord. Jack Allan wrote the following about his experience. The deer we were hunting were at an elevation of about 700 feet. We arrived at the inlet just before dark in the late fall. My partner did not trust the anchorage or the weather, so he opted to stay on the boat while I climbed up to where we knew the deer were to be spending the night. I found a bench and folded myself up into a large piece of visqueen in my sleeping bag on a small outcropping about 8 feet above a well-worn trail. My friend was to meet me at this spot before dawn the next morning, and we knew we would bag some deer easily in the nearby meadow just after it got light enough to shoot. We had seen deer here several times, but had never taken advantage of the fact. Just before I went to sleep, I remember seeing the mast light on the boat in the inlet and imagining the boom hung with our limit of deer. I was awakened before dawn. Around 1 o'clock, my sleeping bag was jerked out from underneath me instantly, like the magician does with the tablecloth and the glass. I awoke the moment it happened, curled into a fetal position and freezing my fanny. I laid there for a few seconds trying to figure out what had just happened. I figured something had just happened to the boat, or my pal had somehow spotted a trove of fat deer. I sat up and pulled on my boots, looking for my mate to explain what was going on. I was still not fully awake, but for fear of scaring the deer, I refrained from calling to my friend. It had snowed almost an inch since I went to sleep, and peering over the edge, I could see people tracks in the snow leading up the hill toward the meadow. I grabbed my rifle and slogged down the hill, peering at the ground in the dark and wondering how and why my somewhat elderly companion had chosen that unusual method of rousing me from my sack. I was stepping in the footprints in the snow. They were dark and easy to see, and was starting to think my partner had not been the one to zip my bag out from underneath me. Then realization struck, and I was gripped with fear. The tracks I was so carefully stepping in were not human. They were the imprints of bare feet, but almost twice the size of my own size 10 boots. This is not real, I thought. I could hear nothing except the snowflakes falling gently to the ground. Every hair on my body was erect, sensing the air for the obvious, logical solution. I cannot shoot anything, I told myself. This is a very carefully planned prank, and all I need to do to lose my control and end up hurting someone. I double-checked the safety on the rifle and determined that this joke was going to be on them. Cool as a cucumber, I walked another few steps up the hill where I would be able to see the crest of the rise I was on. There was a large hemlock tree here, and I decided to climb it and wait out the pranksters, who were trying to scare me out of my wits. Checking the sky, I noticed that within a few minutes the clouds would reveal the full moon, providing me with enough light to see what was going on. I took a few more steps, marveling at the perfection that these guys had achieved with the footprints. Then I knew it was no joke. I felt an unmistakable sense of warning, as clearly as if someone had spoken. It wasn't logic, it wasn't fear, it was communication. I stopped. I looked up, and 15 feet away, one hand on his hip, the other gripping a branch of the hemlock that was just above my head, was the biggest, hairiest guy on 2 legs I ever want to see. Without thinking, I started to thumb the safety off. He turned his head to to stare at me, straight in the eyes. His teeth were showing, but it was not a snarl or a grin. I want to say it was a knowing smile. I knew I could place a killing shot, but I also knew it would be wrong, even criminal. He was saying to me with all the power of the Spirit, "Leave me alone." It was as if more than one voice was speaking to me. It was a collective consciousness whispering with the same longing voice, "Leave me alone." One instant he was there, and the next he turned and fled silently into the woods. At first I thought that it was a dream, but then I could feel that spirit like a mist in the forest, wanting to be left alone. Jack Allan said he recalled little as he ran and tumbled down the hill to the beach, hollering all the way. His partner, who was waiting on the beach, insisted he made the trip down in half the usual time. After daylight, the two retraced Jack Allan's steps up the hillside. The footprints he had followed earlier measured 17 inches long and 5 or 6 inches wide. The impressions left in the mossy ground convinced them the creature had weighed 600 to 800 pounds. When they measured from the ground to the hemlock branch the creature had grasped as he turned, they found the distance was 9.5 feet. "My messenger was 7.5 to 8 feet tall," Jack Allan said. He said the creature looked very much like the one portrayed in the movie, Harry and the Hendersons. This one was actually as large, but more lean. He had long, silky hair. On his arm it was a good 6 inches long. He walked erect and was quiet. He made no sound. He was graceful. His movements were graceful. I couldn't see his face too well, but it seemed like his skin was leathery. His eyes were dark. He had a glint in his eye. He had intelligence. A short time after that encounter, he said, the Wrangell Sentinel carried a photograph taken from the air of the tracks of a two-legged creature in the deep snows of the mountains. Jack Allan, who was 40, was raised on a homestead in the Talkeetna Mountains and has spent his share of time in the Alaska bush. He realizes that telling his story will convince some people he is more in the business of hot air than cold. But, as he says, I've spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between when something is scaring me and I'm scaring myself. There is no question in my mind about what I saw. Twice more during the 5 years he trapped in the area, he became convinced the creatures were nearby and letting him know that he was not welcome. A year and a half after the first incident, he set 40 to 50 traps in a new area, rich with mink sign, only to come back the next day to find the traps had all been sprung. Thinking his adversary was maybe a wolf, he moved some and reset some. When he returned the next day, the traps were again sprung, but there was a stick left in one. Clearly not something one would expect of a wolf. Again, he reset some of his traps and moved others. He returned the third day, again beaching his skiff in the same spot and following the same paths to avoid spreading his scent. All his traps were gone. As he walked along the trail, pondering the mystery, he found himself following in what he thought were his own tracks. Then I realized they were alongside the trail, and that I always stay to the trail, he said. The stride was 1.5 times my usual stride, 5 to 6 feet, and they were left in a deep impression in the moss. I realized it was the Sasquatch, giving me a warning not to be in the area. As I launched the skiff, I heard a rattling down in the water. I looked, and the traps were in a pile by the skiff. Jack Allan said he knew the area well and knew there were no other people in the area. In spite of the signs, the area would provide lucrative furs. He said, The old trap sign he found told him it had not been trapped since 1939. I pulled out of the creek. I didn't disturb any other places in that area, he said. Sometime later, in another remote spot in the islands, he was in the process of putting together a cedar shake shed as a place to store his gear. He had felled a hefty cedar and was hand-splitting shakes from it when his dog began acting strangely. Henry wasn't afraid of anything, not even a wolf. Most dogs are terrified of even the smell of a wolf. This time the usually unruffled dog started to whine and crawled on his belly to the skiff. He climbed into the skiff without permission, something he had been trained never to do, and hunkered down under a seat. Jack Allan at first dragged him out, but the dog continued to act terrified. That made me think, so I took a rifle and walked in a 100-foot circle. Then I stopped. I knew I wasn't alone in the woods, so I got in the skiff and left. Motoring back later, he found the huge cedar that he had been working on had been carried to the bank and dumped into the cove. Without going ashore, he turned the skiff around and left. I didn't want to give any indication that I would go against their will. That's the end of story number 2. Story number 3. Turnagain, Anchorage Borough, Alaska, 1955. Greetings. This is a story my mother told me a few times while I was growing up. I recently asked her to tell me the story again so that I could post it online. I would appreciate any thoughts on what it could have been. My mother was one of 12 children who were turned over to an orphanage in Turnagain, Alaska, about 30 miles outside of Anchorage. There were no other children in this home, and it was apparently run or managed by a priest. We do not know the year the children were surrendered to the orphanage. In or around 1955, my mother would have been around 7 years old. The bedroom assigned to the female children was in the attic, with an attic storage access door leading from either side of this bedroom. There were 4 children in this room, 2 of which slept on a bunk bed and 2 on a full-sized bed. My mother was on the top bunk. The people who ran the orphanage had started saying to the children that if they saw or heard anything upstairs in their room, to wake them immediately and they would kill it. My mother's sisters had told her several times that if she ever saw the creature, not to be afraid, and it would not harm her. She thought they were trying to scare her. One night, my mother was awakened by a noise. As she looked down from her top bunk, she saw a small creature walking upright across the room. She describes it as no more than 2.5 or 3 feet tall, shaped like a human, completely covered in very dark long hair, with limbs not disproportionate with its body. Because it was night and she was only able to make out features as the moonlight through the window allowed, she was not able to clearly see its face, hands, or feet. She watched this creature in terror while it walked about the room. She saw it struggling to reach the covers on the lower beds to apparently cover the children up. When the creature started trying to climb to the top bunk where my mother was, she yelled, "Stay away from me!" When she did this, the creature appeared shocked that she was awake and that she had yelled at it. It abandoned its attempt to climb the bunk and was later seen by my mother trying to take the skeleton key out of the bedroom door. It apparently really wanted that key because it stood there a long time trying to get it out of the door, but never succeeded. She did not see the creature leave the room. However, one of the attic storage doors was out of her line of vision. A few weeks later, the children were told to bring some army rations out of the attic storage space. When they went to retrieve them, they found several ration cans opened and discarded in the far corner, or one of those spaces. She thinks there were more than 12, but less than 20. None of the children had reason to sneak food, so they were not likely suspects for the presence of the empty cans. That was the only encounter my mother had with the creature, much to her relief. My mother isn't one to tell fantastic stories. She is now 62 years old, educated, and a very hard worker. She has no illnesses and takes no medication. She has never told any other wild tales. She has also never tried to seek any attention with this story. In fact, there are only a very few people she has told it to. My mother was adopted when she was 9 and taken from her siblings to Oklahoma. She never again saw or spoke to her siblings until 1997, where she had a purely chance encounter with her older brother at a tribal meeting. When they began talking, they did not know they were siblings until one of them mentioned having grown up in an orphanage in Turnagain, Alaska. It didn't take many more sentences after that for them to learn that he was the child born before her. Within hours of this meeting, while they were still thinking about the orphanage, I asked my uncle if he remembered seeing the creature. His face lit up and he described in detail the same creature my mother had. They had only been talking for a few hours and did not have time to coordinate a fabricated story. I have always wondered what this creature was, and so has my mother. Any ideas? Tina Clark. This is the end of story number 3. Story number 4. The Hairy Man by Lynn Snifka. This is an excerpt from Alaska Magazine article, October 2004, titled Monstrous Mysteries from Lake Beasts to Murderous Mud. Alaska has its share of scary legends, by Lynn Snifka. Snipped portions of Snifka's piece speaks to the issue of the Iliamna Lake Monster, which this website doesn't carry. The Hairy Man. When Donald watches the Discovery Channel, especially programs about the unexplained or mysterious wildlife, he sometimes gets the urge to call his brother-in-law Frank. He and Frank talk, said Donald, who didn't want his last name or the name of his village used, and Frank gets somber and quiet. It's at those times they remember. They remember the night more than 25 years ago, and the creature that stood a good 4 feet above their teenage frames in the early winter moonlight. They remember the long arms, the body covered in thick hair, the face with features that were somehow human, somehow not. They remember its strength. I remember watching when he was running through the alders in the moonlight, Donald recalled. And we have lots of alders there. Athabascans call him Nanit Ina, and warn that he'll steal children and raise them up in the wild. There's the story of a man who shot and injured a hairy man. The creature escaped, but left behind its blood, something akin to transmission fluid. In a 1981 publication from the school in the English Bay, a student wrote of her summer in Port Graham and a mysterious figure in the dark that whistled and scared her and hid behind trees. While some dismiss believers as feeble-minded witnesses, and their supporters speak without doubt, Donald is reserved when he speaks, but certain of what he saw that night. The boys were maybe 16 or 17 years old, Donald said. It was the 1970s, and a typical weekend night in their southwest Alaska village. They stayed up late and played cards at Frank's house. The dog started to go crazy outside, Donald remembered, which usually meant there was a bear around. When the barking didn't subside, the boys decided to investigate. As Frank reached for his rifle, they heard someone, or something, toy with the door latch. A massive figure then moved to a broken window that had been recently patched with scrap glass. The creature tried to reach in, cut itself, and ran. At first, we thought someone was playing around with us, so we decided if it came back, we'd run on outside and chase it, Donald said. We thought it was just some stranger coming up from another village to scare us. Donald and Frank eased back into their evening. Then the creature returned and again fumbled with the door latch. The teens rushed onto the porch, which was built on a foundation nearly 4 feet high, Donald said, and we looked up at him. The creature stood in the snow beyond the house. The teens gave chase toward a series of nearby hills. I remember going up the first hill, and when I got to the top, it was already on the third hill, Donald said. There were a lot of hairy man reports from nearby villages for a while. Donald's grandmother, who lived in a neighboring village, told him a story of when she was younger and caught a hairy man. They trapped him somehow, Donald said, and brought him into the village, and they shaved him and found he was just a runaway from World War II, and the army came and got him. The man gone wild, or outside man, is a common theory in Alaska Native culture, said Phyllis Morrow, professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Morrow studied Yupik culture in western Alaska and found the phenomenon so common that a set of rules exists for encounters with a wild person. You can approach them, Morrow said. You can speak certain things to them in Yupik, and you can draw them back. Again, though, there's the burden of proof. I think it's just myths and stories, said Siebert, the pilot. I've spent over 20 years flying all over, and I look everywhere I fly. I love looking for animals. I've counted for the Fish and Game Department of Alaska just about every kind of animal you can count out there from an airplane, and I've never seen anything I couldn't explain. The outside man, or hairy man, like the Iliamna lake monster, or even the deadly Turnagain mud, may simply be cautionary tales or coping mechanisms, colorful ways to explain the otherwise unexplainable, or tools to ensure respect for one's elders. Reports have certainly become more rare as technology has grown more sophisticated. When village parents can call from house to check on their kids, it might be less important to scare them with stories of the hairy man who may get them if they stray too far from home. How better to keep children away from water's edge than to have them imagine being torn apart by a helicopter or struck ill by a sea monster's gaze? The standards of truth in terms of documented evidence, photographs, stuff like that, you're not going to find it, Morrow said. These are cultural understandings of what happens. It's true in people's experience, and it's meaningful to them. So what, then, of the blood on Frank's window, and Donald, who saw tremendous footprints in the autumn snow? Lynn Snifka is a freelance writer based in Anchorage. Copyright Alaska Magazine, October 2004. This ends story number 4. Story number 5, Strangest Story Ever Told. By Harry D. Kolp. 1900, Thomas Bay, Alaska. The writer of this story has been dead for several years now. At one time, back in the early 30s, he had his story written up, ready to send away. Something happened, and the manuscript was put into a box and forgotten. The story should be listed among the classics, for it occurred before anything was known about hirsute homins, before anyone knew about these beings, anyone except for the natives, that is, and they have known all along. But no one listened until the 21st century. Dear readers, during the years the Devil's Country story had been passed along by word of mouth so often that the details had become obscured. It was then a very pleasant surprise when Mother found the manuscript just a short time ago and gave it to me to read. I found it fascinating, and I was left with a feeling of curiosity. I wonder if any of you readers will be curious. I wonder. Well, I'll just let you wonder. Sincerely, Virginia Culp, daughter of Harry D. Culp. Chapter 1. The spring of 1900 found 4 men batching together in a shack at Wrangell, Alaska. All 4 were broke, as is usual with prospectors. As luck would have it, I was one of the 4. For reasons which will be quite obvious, I will just call the other 3 John, Charlie, and Fred. Charlie came into the shack one night in April, all excited, and said, "Fellows, I have been on the trail of an old Indian for the last month, trying to get him to tell me where he picked up a piece of free gold quartz that he has at his camp." I never say anything about it before, because I wanted to get the story from him first, and today he spilled the beans. He told me to go up to Thomas Bay and camp on Patterson River on the right side, travel upriver for about 8 miles, and then turn to the high mountains. And after traveling about 1.5 miles, I would find a lake shaped like a half moon. Plenty of stone like I found on the slide there, he said. Thomas Bay is known by the Native Americans in Alaska as the Bay of Death. About 150 years ago, a slide down one of the mountains wiped out a village, killing over 500 of the inhabitants. Well, of course, a prospector is ready to stampede on a whisper of a gold any place, and we were no exceptions to the rule. We all talked the matter over, and finally it was decided that we would run our faces for an outfit and send Charlie to look the prospect over. While he was gone, John, Fred, and myself would hustle work somewhere for another grub stake and to pay the old one off. The forepart of May, Charlie loaded his outfit into a canoe and, having favorable weather, left Wrangell for Thomas Bay, which lies northwesterly about 50 miles. He had 3 months' supplies, but was to come back any time sooner if he found out anything. But if he didn't show up in that time, we were to put out a search for him. John and Fred took a contract to get at wood, and I got a job in the Wrangell sawmill. Things went along until the first part of June, when, on a Sunday in late afternoon, we all being home, and in walks Charlie, without a coat or a hat, and looking as if he had been through hell. He didn't give us any greeting whatsoever, just heaved a piece of quartz over into a corner of the room and said, "Get me something to eat. I'm all in, and I want to rest." The fellow looked it, and after he had eaten, he turned in without telling us a thing about his trip. We picked up the piece of quartz, and say, boy, it was sure a pretty thing to look at for a prospector. Oh, it was shot through with gold specks, just like a badly freckled-faced kid. Were we excited? I'll say we were. Just before dark, we walked down to the beach to bring Charlie's outfit in, and as he had come up to the shack with only that piece of quartz in his hand, but there wasn't a thing in the canoe except the oars. Not much sleep for us that night, but Charlie never stopped sawing wood. We had hard work getting Charlie up for breakfast next morning, but when he did roll out, he just ate, borrowed a coat and hat, and left the house without saying a word or even answering the one question out of the many put to him by us. All of us, being excited and feeling ourselves worth a fortune, did not go to work that day, but sat around the shack and passed that blamed piece of rock back and forth to each other while we talked and waited for Charlie to come back and make his report. Oh, believe me, we were anxious to hear it. Along in the afternoon, he came in and said, "Oh, fellas, the SS Drigo will be in on her way south early tomorrow morning. Can you give me enough money for my ticket to Seattle? I'm through with Alaska and never want to see it again. I'll tell you about my trip to Thomas Bay and where I found that quartz, but my advice to you is to forget about it. It will never do you any good and will only cause you a lot of mental and physical pain. If I were not partners, I would never open my lips about this trip or what I found. But if you promise never to mention my name in connection with that, well, what I tell you, or mention the name of Thomas Bay to me again, I'll give you the straight of my experience up there. Well, judge for yourselves as to my saneness, because this is the most astounding thing you ever heard, and as far as I am concerned, is beyond me to reason it out. Don't ask any questions to prolong my story any longer than it takes to tell it, as I want to leave Alaska and forget it if I can. I will try to make one telling plain enough. This is Charlie's story. The first night after leaving Wrangell found me in Ideal Cove. Next night I reached Muddy Bay in time to make camp again. The third night I hit Ruth Island in Thomas Bay. I spent the next day looking up Patterson River for a suitable place for a good camp, which I found a quarter of a mile from Tidewater on the right-hand side, looking up the river. Broke camp on Ruth Island the next day and moved up to the place that I'd picked out the day before, put up my tent, packed up my outfit, and left the canoe on the riverbank. The next day I spent cooking beans, cutting wood, and making things comfortable for a long stay. As it looked like rain, I wanted to get things fixed up to keep dry. It started to rain that night and just kept it up for days. I lost track of time, as each day was just like the one before. Had nothing to read, was all alone, couldn't do anything without getting soaked, and the roar of the river and the wind through the timber just about drove me bugs, so I put in most of my time sleeping. Finally, the weather broke, and I got out. Spent several days in trying to find the old Indians' Half-Moon Lake, but couldn't get it spotted. I did find, about 2 miles from camp upriver, and about a mile from it, a lake shaped like the letter S. Well, on the creek coming out from the lower end, I panned some pretty good colors, but, as I figured, not enough to get all excited about, yet an indication of gold in the country. Talk about a dead country. Whew, that sure is. There doesn't seem to be any life in there at all. You might spend all day in the timber without even seeing a squirrel. I was getting sort of tired of beans, rice, and bacon, so I made up my mind that I would go over to a ridge about 8 miles east of the S Lake and get a few grouse, as I thought I could hear a few hooters up there when I was at the head of this lake. I left come the next morning, which was a fine sunny day. I took only the rifle with me, and when I came to the ridge, sure enough there were a few grouse hooting. I shot 2 and had gotten them when I bagged another one, which fell down the ridge about 100 yards before it hung up. While on my way back down to pick it up, I found that piece of quartz. Up to that time I had paid very little attention to what the country I was in looked like, as it was so heavily timbered and brushy. The formation didn't show up, and I had no tools with me to uncover it. The top of an old snag had broken off and fallen, scraping the top moss loose and dirt for a space of about 8 feet wide and 18 or 20 feet long, uncovering this quartz ledge, which was where I found this piece. This ledge was worked smooth by a glacier at one time. I couldn't find anything to break a piece off with, so I used the butt of my gun to get that piece. In so doing, I broke the butt of my gun, thus ruining it for further use. This didn't worry me any, as I knew there was not a game in the country larger than a grouse. My first thought was of the richness of the quartz and of you fellows, and getting back to town to round you up so we could get busy on it. After looking over and enjoying the feeling of knowing I had made a rich find, I covered the ledge up again with moss, limbs, and rotten chunk. Finishing that job, I thought I would climb the ridge directly over the ledge and get my landmarks, so I could come back to it again, or tell you where it was if anything should happen to me. This I did, climbing straight up over the ledge on the ridge till I reached the top, which was about 600 feet above where I found the ledge. I looked down below me and picked out a big tree with a bushy top, taller than the rest and about 50 feet to the right of the ledge. Looking over the top of this tree from where I stood, I could see out on Frederick Sound, Cape of the Straight Light, the point of Vanderput Spit, Point Vanderput, and turning a little to the left, I could see Sequoia Island, Kodiak, from the mouth of Wrangell Narrows. Satisfied with that, I turned half around to get back a sight on some mountain peaks, and lying below me on the other side of the ridge from the ledge was the half-moon lake the Indian had told me about. Right there, fellows, I got the scare of my life. I hope to God I never see or go through the likes of it again. Swarming up the ridge toward me from the lake were the most hideous creatures. I couldn't call them anything but devils, as they were neither men nor monkeys, yet looked like both. They were entirely sexless, their bodies covered with long, coarse hair, except where the scabs and running sores had replaced it. Each one of them seemed to be reaching out for me and striving to be the first one to get me. The air was full of their cries, and the stench from their sores and the bodies, it made me faint. I forgot my broken gun and tried to use it on the first ones, and then I threw it at them and turned and ran. Oh, God, how I did run! I could feel their hot breath on my neck. Their long, claw-like fingers scraped my back. The smell from their steaming, stinking bodies was making me sick, while the noises they made, yelling, screaming, and breathing drove me mad. Reason left me. How I reached the canoe or how I hung on to that piece of quartz is a mystery to me. When I came to, it was night, and I was lying in the bottom of my canoe, drifting between Thomas Bay and Sequoia Island, cold, hungry, and crazy for a drink of water. But only to satisfy the latter urge, I started for Wrangell, and here I am. You no doubt think I am either crazy or lying. Well, all I can say is, there is the quartz. Never let me hear the name of Thomas Bay again, and for God's sake, help me get away tomorrow on that boat. So passed out Charlie from our lives. We put his story down as a fantasy, caused by loneliness and morbid thought. This ends the 5 stories. Thank you for listening. Welcome. This story is being brought to you by William Jevning and is being narrated by me, Jim Sower. This story comes to us from Argosy Magazine, December 1977. It's titled Bigfoot, Man, Beast, or Myth, and is written by Jeff Williams. The number of reports from respected people, the finding of footprints in areas too remote for pranksters to expect success, lends credibility to the belief that something is out there. But what? There was a downdraft of cool mountain air following Virgil Larsen as he moved down the forested slopes of Mount Shasta. Even though weighted by a chainsaw and tools, Larsen moved through the Northern California woods with practiced ease. He was a timber faller and had worked in the woods for 30 of his 47 years. His partner, Pat Conway, was off to the left, and Larsen could no longer see or hear him. At the base of a towering Douglas fir, Larsen sat down for a quick smoke. It was 8:30, Friday, September 3rd. As he smoked and enjoyed the cathedral solitude of the forest, he heard the sound of someone moving toward him from above, the sound of feet breaking the carpet of twigs and underbrush. Idly, Larsen looked up and saw a figure moving easily toward him through the light-patterned woods. Must be the Forest Service guy coming down to check what we're cutting, he mused to himself. He glanced back at the figure, which had closed to 30 feet, but was moving away at a tangent. Thinking the ranger had missed him, Larsen yelled, At that, the figure turned his head toward Larson as if seeing him for the first time, but kept moving away in long, swinging strides. Larson yelled again at the tall figure as it dropped down the ridge a little and disappeared behind a screen of trees. Larson began to get to his feet to see where it had gone. Abruptly, a few dozen feet below him, the tall creature rose from behind a bush and stared balefully at him for a long second before disappearing. At that moment, I realized I didn't know what the hell I was looking at, and that's when I took off. Larson, a normally quiet and reserved man, ran in terror down the other slope to his partner. Together, he and Conway returned to where Larson had been sitting. That was when they first became aware of the stomach-churning odor in the forest. It smelled rotten and rancid like an old bear hide, Larson recalled. To estimate the creature's size, Conway went behind the bush where it had been. Only by pushing his hat up on a stick could he be located behind the bush that the creature had easily looked over. It had to be about 7 feet tall, but I don't know what it was, Larson said. I can only remember it looking over the bush, and I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk through the woods on 2 feet. I can only remember from the hairline up, just dark hair pushed straight back. I can't remember the face at all. Larson studied the burning cigarette between his fingers and quietly admitted he lies awake now, wondering what he saw. Was it Sasquatch? The giant ape-man that thousands believe stalks the vast mountainous forest regions between Northern California and British Columbia? Larson just shakes his head. The shock of seeing something so strange has blanked his mind on the subject. Larson's foreman, when questioned about the reliability of his faller, was blunt. "Let me put it this way," said Ralph Gant. "If Larson told me he had seen Jesus Christ, I would believe him." Sergeant Walt Bullington, the deputy sheriff who investigated the sighting, said, "I think he's telling the truth, and as he knows it, he's not falsifying." Larson is just one of numerous reliable men who have spent years in the woods and have nothing to gain but the scorn of fellow workers who admit to seeing that giant hairy creature commonly known as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Unquestionably, there are mistaken sightings and outright hoaxes, but the number of reports by respected men finding of footprints in areas too remote for pranksters to expect success lends credibility to the belief that something is out there. And that something is generally reported to be about 7 feet tall, covered with dark hair and virtually no neck. It has massive shoulders. Obviously, is heavy and leaves man-like footprints 14 to 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. The reports are not just a new fad. In April of 1840, the Reverend Elkanah Walker, missionary to the Spokane Indians, wrote a long letter to his superior filled with misgivings on the future of the Indians. They seem as fated to fade away before the whites as the game of their country. In closing, he added this surprising note: "I suppose you will bear with me if I trouble you with a little of their superstition. They believe in the existence of a race of giants which inhabit a certain mountain off to the west of us. They say their track is about 1.5 feet long. They will carry 2 or 3 beams on their back at once. They frequently come in the night and steal their salmon from the nets and eat them raw. If the people are awake, they always know when they are coming very near, by their strong smell, which is most intolerable. It is not uncommon for them to come in the night and give 3 whistles, and then the stones will begin to hit their homes." Since that early report, stories of Sasquatch have become legend. One of the most controversial pieces of evidence surrounding the creature centers on a short length of 16mm film shot in 1967 by a rancher named Roger Patterson. Patterson, now dead, said he and his partner, Bob Gimlin, were looking for Bigfoot along the rugged Bluff Creek in northern California when their horses suddenly spooked. Patterson was thrown, but struggled to his feet with camera in hand to make a jerky film of what appears to be a female Sasquatch moving away rapidly at an oblique angle. The creature turns and looks toward the camera, and her ponderous, hairy breasts are visible. Precisely because she had no hair on her breast, the film was rejected by many scientists who note that even on gorillas there is virtually no hair. Also, it walked in an upright manner that was unacceptable to most scientists. It was a powerful, rolling gait of considerable speed, yet it did not run. However, even the specialists at Disney Studios could not prove the film a fake. A group of Soviet scientists who are searching for their own Bigfoot, which they call, more accurately, a relic hominoid, viewed the film and agreed that because of the size of the muscles rippling visibly beneath the hairy coat, it was not likely faked, wrote Dr. Dmitry D. Donskoy, chief of the chair of biomechanics at the USSR Central Institute of Physical Culture in Moscow. With all the diversity of the locomotion illustrated by the creature in the footage, its gait, as seen, is absolutely non-typical of man. Apart from the film, footprints with the distinctive hourglass outline are the only tangible evidence that such a creature, a giant creature, may in fact exist. And those footprints trouble the highly scientific mind of Dr. John Napier, a visiting professor of primate biology at the University of London. In his book, Bigfoot, Napier studied hundreds of samples of the broad prints and said, "There is a curious and persuasive consistency about the hourglass footprints. They present an aberrant but nevertheless uniform pattern. This is hard to reconcile with fakery." Napier, a specialist in the anatomy of ape and human feet, also studied casts from a set of prints in Bossburg, Washington, that stretched half a mile. Napier was surprised to find that the right foot was a club foot, possibly the result of a crushing injury in childhood. It is very difficult to conceive of a hoaxer so subtle, so knowledgeable, and so sick, who would deliberately fake a footprint of this nature. I suppose it is possible, but it is so unlikely that I am prepared to discount it. Napier concludes by saying, "I am convinced that the Sasquatch exists, but whether it is all that it is cracked up to be is another matter altogether. There must be something in Northwest America that needs explaining, and that something leaves man-like footprints. The evidence I have adduced in favor of the reality of Sasquatch is not hard evidence. Few physicists, biologists, or chemists would accept it, but nevertheless it is evidence and cannot be ignored. This conclusion, even from such an eminent scientist, sticks in the throat of Dr. William Montagna, director of the prestigious Oregon Regional Primate Research Center. In a scathing denunciation of the Sasquatch legend and its investigators, Montagna wrote in the September Primate News, "Fascinated by the unknown and goaded by his imagination, man is forever fabricating devils and saints. Nothing is to be gained by arguing with believers. Incapable of sifting reality from fantasy, they swear to have seen the footprints of Bigfoot or of the abominable snowman, yeti, and to have heard their chilling roars. Even the tricksters who would perpetrate these outlandish hoaxes sometimes come to believe in the reality of their creatures." Montagna appears unwilling to at least keep an open mind on Sasquatch, but other eminent scientists are pursuing their investigations. Edward W. Cronin, Jr., a zoologist who spent 2 years in the Himalayas looking for the yeti, concluded it had to exist after awakening one morning to find a clear set of prints in light and unmarred snow outside his tent. The yeti, which may be a smaller, distant relation to the Sasquatch, passed by Cronin's tent and proceeded down a steep and dangerous slope that made it evident to the zoologist that the creature was far stronger than he was. He concluded in an article for the November 1975 issue of The Atlantic that based on this experience, I believe there is a creature alive today in the Himalayas which is creating a valid zoological mystery. As evidence mounts that both a yeti and a sasquatch exist, the question of what exactly it is becomes more pertinent. The leading contender in the minds of a few scientists is Gigantopithecus, a massive creature that existed as late as 500,000 years ago in the Himalayas in China. His few fossil remains indicate he was more than 7 feet tall. Dr. Paul Simons, the senior physical anthropologist at the University of Oregon, told me in an interview that it is conceivable that Gigantopithecus crossed the land bridge at the Bering Strait just as man did some 50,000 years ago. My basic feeling is there is no such thing, but I'm not willing to rule it out, Simons said. He then added a fascinating bit of evidence that Gigantopithecus might have migrated while other primates like the gorilla remained in the tropics. He noted that chimpanzees and gorillas wear their teeth down similarly, and that Gigantopithecus and early man wore their teeth down in the same fashion. So it looks as though there is a similar jaw action, Simons said. Does that mean they went looking for similar food? At least it means their dietary adaptation was not similar to the chimp and the gorilla who stayed in the tropics, but it's hard to go beyond that. He said if there is something roaming the great northwest forests, why hasn't someone found conclusive proof? Skeletal remains, hair, or fossils? Such questions make thousands of skeptics react like Den Mott, a rancher who has spent most of his 42 years hunting and fishing in the mountains of California. Bigfoot is just a bunch of crap. With all those hunters out there every year, someone would have found one or shot one by now if it was really there. One man who ardently believes both that Sasquatch is in fact out there, but should never be shot, is Peter Byrne, a Britisher. Actually, he's Irish, in his early 50s. Byrne has all the rugged looks of a professional game hunter, which is precisely what he was for 20 years in Nepal. Then, beginning in 1962, he made 2 expeditions in search of the yeti. Although both failed, Byrne became convinced the yeti existed. Then, at the urging of Texas oil millionaire Tom Slick, Byrne came to the Northwest to use his hunting skills in finding Sasquatch. For 6 years, Byrne has continued his lonely search, what he terms the ultimate hunt, but now, instead of a rifle, he carries a camera. From the modest trailer he calls home in the Dalles, Oregon, Byrne points at the dark coniferous forest that begins not far away. Once you go 50 feet into those forests, you simply disappear. It is as dense as any jungle, and we're dealing with a nomadic group, or individuals who stay in an area only one day before moving on. This adds to the difficulty of finding them. Byrne notes that the soil of the Northwest is too acidic for fossils, and that if a Sasquatch did die in the forest, other animals would eat it and scatter the bones within days. With only a handful of the creatures around and thousands of square miles of extremely rugged mountains, it is conceivable for Sasquatch to remain largely invisible. One only has to recall Ishi, the last of a Stone-Aged Indian tribe who remained hidden with his family in a canyon only 8 miles from Oroville, California in the early 1900s until he voluntarily appeared. The Tassidae tribe, another Stone Age people, were found in the Philippine jungles only in 1971. The mountain gorilla was not proven until 1902. Byrne, who has never seen or heard a Sasquatch, has seen 16 separate sets of prints that he, a veteran tracker, believes to be the real thing. If he feels sure that the Sasquatch are out there, why continue to hunt them down? It doesn't seem important except for one reason. We're not going to get protective legislation for something that is not proven. When it is known to exist, there will be expeditions, and some scientific expeditions can be awfully ruthless. We hope there will be full protection to the point where even a scientific expedition from the Smithsonian Institution will not be allowed to collect a specimen. Another veteran Sasquatch hunter is George Haas, a scholarly 70-year-old man who lives in an Oakland, California apartment filled with books and files on Sasquatch. Haas has the most extensive files on Sasquatch in the country, 3,000 news clippings alone. Like Byrne, he is strongly opposed to any talk of killing a Bigfoot just to prove it exists. The last thing we need to do is shoot or even capture a specimen. It is more than a rare animal. It may be a primitive man. To kill him would be murder. Indeed, why find him at all? To protect him, some argue. But if Sasquatch is proven to exist, there will be massive hunts by amateurs and professionals alike. It seems all too conceivable that the pressure of organized drives for Sasquatch, complete with helicopters and listening devices as used in Vietnam, would force the creature totally out of the area or into extinction. Find Sasquatch? To what end? So he could spend his life behind bars in a zoo? Or be constantly probed and prodded by scientists, made cranky because they will have to rewrite their concepts of evolution? If Sasquatch exists, and the weight of evidence that he does is too much to ignore, then it seems best to let him and our dreams continue happily apart. We may find that we enjoy the legend of Sasquatch much more than the smelly beast itself. Copyright Argosy Magazine, December, January 1977. This is the end of the story. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning, @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.